The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and education. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they had been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and joining us on today's program is Doug White, who's director of the Center for Coexistence at Baruch College of the City University of New York. And Doug, what is the purpose of the Coexistence Center at Baruch?
Well, first of all, let me just say that it was our view that issues of race, ethnicity, gender, religious diversity as well, that these issues had not been enough of the part of the curriculum in universities. And at the School of Public Affairs, we thought we should face those issues head on and talk about those issues, how that public policy for those issues, how it's developed and how it's put in place. So we believe that, by doing it in the teaching context, it would be something that students would get a tremendous amount out of. Also sensitizing them to a whole range of issues. That's one part of it. The other part of it is we feel that the Coexistence Center should hold symposiums, conferences. We should do research with other organizations like, for instance, NAACP or ADL. I've spoken with both of those organizations about doing research that they feel is significant and joining with Baruch College to do that. So we feel that the research, the teaching, the symposiums, the conferences, all put together will go a long way toward sensitizing students toward issues of coexistence. We believe in the long term there's room for what we call coexistence workers. That is to say, working in corporations, working in not-for-profits, working in schools, wherein you have issues, and you have issues in all of those places of ethnicity and race and gender. And we believe that we can produce workers, students, maybe a degree program eventually to do that.
Does coexistence then mean that people who have hostile backgrounds and hostile concerns learn to accommodate each other, just live together, or does coexistence mean that they work toward this e pluribus unum that we talk about in the United States of America?
Well, I think what we're talking about is that at the ground level, it would be important for people to get along, and I'd love for people to love each other, but I don't expect that to happen. I think that, you know, by and large, if people can get along and understand each other, that's important. And that's basically the idea. We played around with the title for a long time. This issue of coexistence sounds more international than it does local. But I think part of the reason is that if you look way down the road, we frankly would like to do this internationally as well, working with the United Nations and international peace organizations to train workers for that as well.
Well, W.E. Du Bois in 1900 said the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. And he was certainly correct in that extent.
Still is.
And now we're coming to the new millennium, the 21st century, and the color line is one of those major issues around which coexistence occurs. In addition, we have the element of gender, which in the beginning of the 20th century, women couldn't vote until 1920. We have the issue of immigration. We have the issue of diversity of religion, the growing of the increase of but religions that had not been very numerous in our country, the Muslim religion, some of the Asian religions. Now, how does that fit into the real need for a coexistence? Are we just trying to get people to accommodate each other, or are we trying to build on the strength of these various diverse groups to make the country a stronger place?
Oh, I don't think that if I left that out, I think that that's a very good point. I do think that that these groups that you named all bring a certain dynamic to the table. And I think that it enriches all of us that they bring these dynamics. I mean, I've often thought with all of my criticism of the United States, I mean, one of the things I think that's greatest about it is it's this tremendous diversity, and as opposed to many other countries. And so I think that if we can build on those, on that diversity, I think it makes us a much stronger country. And I think particularly for the next 100 years or whatnot, from a standpoint of business, from a standpoint of morality, even from all of those, I think it makes us a much stronger country if we can deal with this issue of coexistence along the lines you just mentioned.
Of course, it could be said by some the country was strongest when it was controlled by the white population and where blacks were slaves and you didn't have to worry about paying them, and we could go ahead and we could pollute the air and attack the environment and expand our economic potential, and that was the so-called greatness of America. Now, why has that changed?
Well, first of all, it was just wrong.
You mean morally wrong?
It was morally wrong, but I think it was just wrong. I mean, I don't think that you know, slavery. I mean, it didn't work in Rome. It didn't work. It didn't work. It has not worked in the United States from an economic standpoint, and I don't think it made sense. And I think that as people moved in, as you brought immigrants from Europe, from different groups, as you brought slavery in, obviously, as you brought people from South America. Many diverse groups into this country, it just changed the mix tremendously. For instance, as you well know, I mean, another 50 years or so, I mean, Spanish may very well be spoken by more people in this country than English. And so I think that the issue that this country was a better place when white men primarily, because that was what it was about. People often mention that Yale University is a good example. When I attended the law school there, from 68 to 71, in 1969, women were admitted to the college for the first time. And there were very few people of color, you know, certainly in the law school, much less than even today. And most people felt, and you would hear, most white people felt that Yale, bring back the standards of Yale in that period. I mean, it's even hard to imagine. I mean, that the standards of Yale were much higher when legacy was probably everything to get into a school like Yale. I mean, George Bush, I mean, and all of his sons have gone to Yale. So I think that, and that's legacy, but that doesn't mean that's merit. That's just the way it worked in those days. So I think it's a real improvement to diversify institutions. I don't think institutions can survive over the next 50 years or so to be really vital institutions without a tremendous amount of diversity.
Of course, the demography of the country will have a lot to do with it. It's estimated by 2040 or 2045, half of this country will be people of color. So that means that society needs to accommodate them in the workforce, and if society doesn't utilize them, our society will not be economically competitive. But what about the moral thrust of this country? Thomas Jefferson, even though he was a slaveholder, wrote some beautiful words in the Declaration of Independence, and Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and John Adams all talked about the equanimity of man, the equality of man. They did emphasize man. They didn't talk about women at that time. But what about that, assuming this encompasses men and women, to what extent is diversity a support for the larger ethos of the country, or to what extent is the antagonisms that come out of the grasping for things by various diverse groups tend to set the country back?
Well, I mean, there's no question that when Jefferson and Washington and all of them, actually, when they wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, they were excluding women, they were excluding people of color, I mean, certainly slaves, they were excluding Native Americans, so all of those groups were excluded, and that was really not something they were comprehending. They did not comprehend that these people had something to offer. Some of their statements, and I believe it's in the Constitution, about Native Americans are absolutely atrocious. They specifically go after them in the Constitution. So I think it's really interesting. But I think that the issues of diversity today, the issues of bringing, of having vital groups such as of all people of color, part of the general political family has empowered this country, has empowered it tremendously. I think that it...
In what way?
Well, I think that it's made it richer culturally. That's number one, I think. It's made it stronger in terms of how it's seen by its neighbors. When I mean neighbors, I mean internationally.
The world community.
The world community. I mean, the best example is when African nations started to rise, it was no question that many in the United States whites felt things had to change for that reason alone, because how would they be viewed? So I think that so it empowers the United States internationally by having an international community at home, and one that gets along relatively anyway. So it's both culturally, it's politically, in terms of that empowerment. And I think economically, in an increasingly small world, in terms of where IBM does business or any of the international corporations, I think it's important that those organizations are peopled by people of diversity, have a diverse community in those institutions. So it makes their, financially, I think, from a business standpoint, it makes sense. So I think in all of those ways.
But here we have these major multinational corporations, many of them operating overseas with populations of workers who are predominantly minority. Yet at the very, very top, at CEO level, at CFO level, Chief Financial Officer level, there are practically no people of color, no minorities, no women. Now, why is that?
I think it's just deep-seated racism, institutional racism.
Well, why do you say that? Because some people say, well, the people who reach the top of these corporations are the smartest, the most aggressive, the best ones at turning a deal. And to turn a deal, you got to work with people like yourself. You don't need to work with diverse people.
Well, Jefferson was smart. You know, the founding fathers were smart. You know, it has nothing to do with smartness. I think it has a lot to do with it's the blindness that that many in the white community have in terms of people of color. They are blind because of their own privilege. They don't, and that's something they don't want to share. And in many instances, I think most would not even recognize it in any real conscious way. They might recognize certain things that they may not want people of color in their family, their immediate family, that kind of thing. But in terms of working with them, they say, oh, he's a nice chap. He's a nice chap to work with. They may feel that way, but the truth is that it's a very small community, and that community excludes, and excludes for all of those reasons, I think.
But class gets into this as well. As you were talking about white people having everything, there's many, probably more poor white people than there are poor black people in this country, in terms of numbers, not percentage.
Yes.
And so there is a class element to this. And as the nation becomes more diverse, there will be classes within the diverse populations. So one of the issues that we have to deal with in the 21st century is how do we deal with this mix of race and gender and ethnicity and class. And that's something I think you would probably be considering. But I want to go to your Center for Coexistence and what you actually do in the classroom. Do you give them examples?
Well, I give
do you
examples.
Discuss issues? How do you work that?
Well, we were talking in this particular course on government and public policy. You know, a lot of it really is dealing with the evolution of this country as well, talking about Jefferson and all of those, and Washington, et cetera. And it moves up through talking about Brown v. Board of Education, things of that sort. And one of the things we're talking about often is inclusion and how people are included. In one case, I thought that I think it's extremely significant. I might add that cases sort of drive a lot of public policy, whether it's Brown v. Board.
You mean legal cases?
Legal cases, yeah, on choice. A lot of things that go before the Supreme Court, you know, are things that drive such national public policy.
Because that's the beauty of the American system. Instead of solving it with a gunpoint and a takeover, we go to the courts.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the cases I teach, for instance, is Korematsu. And Korematsu was the Japanese internment cases. And one of the reasons I teach that is it brings an element, it brings Asian Americans in the classroom in a very strong way. And you have a case where the Supreme Court justices are actually saying, I can't believe my brother such and such said that. That's downright racist. I mean, you have such a clear situation of racism in a relatively modern case, because Korematsu was decided in the 40s. You know, so I teach Korematsu in that course. Or we talk about the issues of what goes into certain kinds of school decisions. Why in Hartford, in a certain case, was it decided in a certain way, and how it evolved, and why were certain monies denied in the minority community as opposed to the white community, how that works. So so all of these situations we deal with in that kind of concrete way, as much as we can, from section to section, depending upon what it is. We try to find cases or things that would drive home the point of the importance of looking at this issue of race, gender, diversity, ethnicity, and putting it right on the table.
Recently, your center ran a conference, or I believe you called it a conference on reconnections. And
No, it was on intergroup relations and public policy, and we were trying to bring a number of people in the room from academia, from government, etc., and deal with a few topics. We brought in Chuck Lawrence from Georgetown Law Center, who talked about hate speech in public policy. We had a panel on affirmative action after Texaco, and we had a panel on race and ethnicity in public policy. And then we had Dean Morton, who formerly of St. John the Divine, who now heads the Interfaith Center, talk about the whole question of intergroup relations and how that works and how that plays out.
If the country did not have such racial diversity, do you think that the country would be as strong as it is economically? I know it wouldn't be as strong culturally because our diversity in culture means it, but do you think the country would be as strong economically if we didn't have the race question to deal with?
Well, I think that you're saying that you think the race question makes it a stronger country economically?
Yeah, that really, the question is, so many of these court cases had to do with the rights of African Americans, basically, and a struggle to resolve the words of the Constitution with the prejudices of the people. And some have said that if we didn't emphasize race so much, and if the country was more homogeneous racially, we wouldn't have these problems, and we would be a stronger country.
Well, first of all, the first part of that is I think that race is there. It's like
it's a reality.
It's a reality. It's a little bit like in the O.J. Simpson case, which everyone knows about, it seems. They were talking about constantly about Johnny Cochran playing the race card. The race card was on the table. It was not a question of playing the race card. It was there.
It was on the table because Simpson was black.
Simpson was black.
And he was dealing with a white woman.
He was dealing with a white woman. That was one part of it. The other part of it was, we do know the studies of the LA Police Department are atrocious with respect to how they deal with people of color. And that's also an issue. So I'm just saying the race card was on the table. So I don't think it's something that we can avoid in not dealing with. I think that the issue of having a very diverse community makes us strong economically as well, yes.
See, that gets into the immigration question, because at one time this country did try to restrict the number of people from colored nations from coming into the country, and also restrict the number of people from various
also from Asia, and also the Karen McWalters Act, I think it was called.
Now the reason for that was we wanted to save American jobs, and some of the people said we wanted to keep this country as pure as we could. All of a sudden that changed. That changed because of the presence of communism, and we wanted to then bring the anti-communist forces here, and in the case of Cuba, we bring the people who were against Cuba, which is basically a black country, and yet the people we bring are basically the lighter-skinned Cubans. How does this fit into the political and economic thrust of our country? Are we doing these things merely because of economic reasons, or are we doing them because of our need to react to the broader world in terms of its diversity of the broader world?
Well, I think originally the opening of the country to certain kinds of immigration was for both economic and political reasons. I'm not obviously excluding the whole question of slavery, because that was not immigration. So I think that initially it was for reasons of economics and for reasons of political power, and extending one's power throughout the world. And today I think that the issue of we still bring a fair amount of immigrants into this country, and I think that will probably continue. I might also add, it does play somewhat with the whole, play against, or with, I should say, the whole idea of the image of America and bringing people, that plays into it as well. So that's a third piece, that it's important to bring people from around the world to be included in this mix. But I think that this whole issue right now of trying to keep people out, obviously, I think has a lot to do with the whole question of English being almost a second language in a few years, and also of diluting the political power of people who are presently in power. They're very concerned about that. Particularly if I'm sure they feel that almost 3 out of 4 people who come in from Mexico are going to vote Democratic, as an example. So there are people who are against that. So I think it's all wrapped into that. I mean, obviously there is a question too, of economic question of whether or not they're displacing others in terms of jobs. I mean, I don't know what the numbers are on that though, and it wouldn't surprise me that it doesn't have any effect on that issue of impacting on jobs nationally.
Well, all of these things come into focus on affirmative action.
Yes.
And the resolutions in California against affirmative action, the English-only resolutions in Texas and so on, all of those things are related to this question of diversity. How do you see this playing itself out?
Well, I don't think any institutions in the long term, there's a continuum. Things run run right across like this, but they go also like this. I think that the whole question of affirmative action, which is not having an easy time right now, will, I think, in the long term play itself out, and I think that affirmative action will be with us for a very long time.
Well, do you mean we need legal affirmative action, or you mean the demographics and the elements in the marketplace will provide affirmative action?
I think we have to have legal affirmative action. Because I think that because of institutional racism primarily, it's going to be with us for a long time as well. And if we find that we have an organization that is essentially all white, it is no question that that organization can be challenged, and if you get into a court, you can even put in place quotas under any of these cases, even today, if you find that people of color are underutilized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
But see, this gets into the whole question of government interference with commerce. For example, with tobacco, they want to stop tobacco companies from marketing to children. They want to control them. And there are many people, not the majority probably, but many people who feel the government has no place in business. They should just let business do whatever they want to do because that's the way the country got great. How do you answer that question?
Well, first of all, government subsidize agriculture and agribusinesses. It's subsidizing tremendously in terms of price supports. You have issues of subsidizing many of the great universities in this country through research dollars in terms of the kinds of things that they would like to see. The whole, at one time, if you recall, when New York City was verging on bankruptcy, or in bankruptcy, one of the motor companies, the car companies, was in bankruptcy as well. The federal government thought nothing of trying to bail them out, but I had a big thing about bailing New York out. I mean, just as a contrast. So I don't think there's any question that the government has always intervened. That's what governments do, is intervene.
So therefore, you support the need for official human rights agencies, both at the federal level and the state level.
Oh, no question about it.
Having been a former commissioner, you probably would feel that. But in terms of, that was a few years ago, in terms of just the needs today, you still think there's a need for an official human rights agency and strong laws related to affirmative action?
Yes. If you got on a bus at 42nd Street and went up 6th Avenue, and you stopped off at any major corporation, I guarantee if you went in there, that people of color are underutilized in the high-paying positions, and there are very few people of color on any of the boards. You get back on the bus, go uptown, Central Park West. I'm sure many of those apartment buildings along there still discriminate against people of color. No question about it. I mean, you get on the bus and travel all over New York City and still see that.
So the empirical test is that discrimination does exist, despite the ethos that suggests that diversity is desirable and our country provides equal opportunity. We need someone to monitor that, and that's what, in a sense, civil rights agencies do.
I don't think there's any question about it. We have, how many people do we have in the Senate? How many people of color? One black person, anyway, in the United States Senate. Absolutely ridiculous. I mean, just to look around you, it's just.
But of course, affirmative action doesn't really deal with the Senate, except in the Voting Rights Act.
No, I'm only thinking about it in terms of it's the general color of America and its important institutions. I think for institutions to be vital in the coming century, they're going to have people of color throughout them.
Okay, today we've been talking with Doug White, who directs the Center for Coexistence at Baruch College of City University of New York, and we've been talking about the issues of diversity in 21st century America.